Hello, I'm Melissa Phillips, and welcome to another session provided by the Games Leadership Network and Academy. We're really excited to share this talk with you by Dr. 𝗔𝗓cie 𝗂𝗿, who is going to be exploring leadership lessons through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the games industry. But before we jump into the talk, just a quick note about who we are. So the Games Leadership Network is a non-profit organization that provides free events and support for the industry, just like today's session. And we're also supported by the Games Leadership Academy, who provides paid courses, coaching, and training around leadership in the games industry. And one thing that we're really excited about is our new Games Leadership Blueprint. This is a 12-week program launching later this year. So whether you're already leading teams or maybe looking at stepping into a leadership role, then this program helps you to build a personalized leadership blueprint that aligns with your values and studio goals, so that you can plan and create an impact that will set your studio up for more success. If you want to learn more about that, then you can check us out at www.gamesleadershipacademy.com. Right, let's hear from Dr. 𝗔𝗓cie 𝗂𝗿.
All right, let's do this. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Dan and Mel, for having me and inviting me to come and talk. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I know that this is one of those topics that is both recent and perennial. So yeah, let's just get into this. Hello, I am Dr. 𝗔𝗓cie 𝗂𝗿. I am a senior advanced producer at 𝗔𝗊𝗄𝗁, which is a studio here in Seattle. A little bit about me. I start with a little introduction here. I've been in the industry for almost 10 years now. I'm currently at Probably Monsters, but before that, I was a producer at Harebrained Schemes, where I led production on Lamplighters League and worked on BattleTech and its expansions. And before that, I was at Bungie, where I worked on Destiny 2 and its first round of expansions. So yeah, that was kind of my way into the industry. I also serve on the board of directors at the Global Game Jam. And here are some of the leadership programs I've been part of. So you can see Games Leadership Network is being repped there, and also part of a couple of other organizations and programs. But before I got into games, I was actually a college professor in moral and political philosophy. And I also taught the philosophy of race and gender. So what this really means is I studied power structures and tried to understand who has power and who doesn't have power. How do you get power? What do we even mean by this? And I know this doesn't sound super relevant for games, but it actually really has been, because a lot of my DEI work has been informed by my academic understanding of these issues and my lived experience kind of combined. So when I talk about DEI issues in the games industry, where I've had the most traction is not just me talking as a person about something that's happened to me as a person, but also having the studies and the data to back it up and information on what has worked so we can improve things. So given all that, what is this talk about? So this talk is really in three parts. The first is an overview on concepts of power. And what I'll do is I'll kind of talk about the DEI work that I've done, and then finally do an analysis of that work by understanding the exchange of power in that space. But also, more abstractly, this is a story about hope, because there are so many stories in this industry that are just about despair. And, you know, we have all these huge cultural problems, and we're also individually so small. So how can we possibly change any of it? And it's very easy to kind of go down this like terrible spiral when you start thinking that. So what I really want to do is challenge that idea, because fundamentally it might be true that no individual can change the entire games industry and solve all the inclusion and cultural problems that we have. But I also believe that we each have a sphere of influence and we can make a positive difference in that sphere. So you might not be able to change a studio of 800 to 1,000 people, but you might be able to impact how people feel on the teams that you work on and how included they feel. And the other cool thing is that other people also have spheres of influence. So you can kind of imagine all these little spheres of influence overlapping, and they can have this far-reaching effect. Another way I like to think about this is thinking about this idea that we each have a little spark inside of us, and I can light up my community around me, and someone can in that community can also take that fire and light up their community, and so on and so forth until we reach critical mass for change. I've also said here, this is a talk about power and influence, and I believe everyone has what I call soft power, which is your ability to create change. So even if you don't officially have a leadership title yet, this is a way you can still bring about change, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So really, talking about Studio DEI initiatives is the lens through which I want to talk about leadership and power and driving for change. Okay, so before we start doing that, I want to touch on something that's pretty philosophical. Power is a social construct. Now, what this means is that power is a thing that does not innately exist. It's something that exists because we just all believe it exists. So another example might be money. So think about how money works. Money is a social construct. Like there's nothing magical or special about like a piece of paper with someone's face on it, but we all believe it has a particular value and we all behave as if it has a particular value. And it's such that now we've built entire like systems like banking and capitalism and whatever, and we built these all around this idea that it has value. And likewise, when I talk about power, I'm talking about a thing that isn't real, but it still affects your life. Like we've built social and political structures around it. So if you go to people in leadership, whether it's at your company or in your government or whatever, and you're like doing this, things might kind of go bad for you pretty quick. So we all have to buy into this kind of shared notion that this is a thing, even though we might realize it's not really a thing. And the downside, of course, is we're all playing along with this, and this is just this collective performance we're doing. But the upside is because power is socially constructed, it's squishy, right? Like there's no set amount people have. We understand that it can transfer, but we don't have a clear way of understanding like the different ways we can wield it. So let's talk about that next. So there are different ways to carve up how we understand power. This is the one I like because it's pretty straightforward. So if you were at GDC this year, you might have seen, I've talked a little bit about hard power and soft power there. This is a little bit of a rehash of that, but I think it's a really important concept to understand, especially for leadership. So normally when we talk about power, we're talking about this thing that is hard leadership power. That is, you have the coercive power of your title or your role to drive change. So if you think about an organizational structure, these are structures of hard power. They have hierarchies, there's directors, there's managers, and hard power is often imposed by someone who has it on someone who doesn't. So if your manager says, do this thing because I say so, because they say so is a justification to do the thing. But by contrast, soft power appeals to your values or your culture to drive change rather than your authority. So it's the ability to co-opt rather than coerce. Think about like, this is what you do as peers or when you manage upwards. So if you're trying to get your manager to do something, then you can't say do this because I say so, but you might appeal to like, what your shared norms are or what you both value to get them to bring about a change. So everyone simultaneously experiences and possesses soft power because it's just in how you treat each other. It doesn't matter where you are in your company hierarchy. It doesn't matter what your org structure is. It's just how you interact with and influence other people. Now, if you have both of these things, you might see soft power as a threat to hard power, but I argue that soft power necessarily coexists with hard power because before you had hard power, like, before you had the title or whatever your authority is, you had soft power. And this is especially important because most DEI initiatives begin with soft power. Like company leaders, that is the people who have hard power, just will not make DEI initiatives out of the goodness of their own hearts. Because if they wanted to do that, they could have done that already through hard power. But in order for a DEI initiative to even get off the ground, you need to use soft power to drive them towards that change. So here are just a couple of examples of how I did this. I founded the Bungie Diversity Committee in January of 2017. I started at Bungie in 2016, and at that time, they were going through a really big cultural change with hiring up a lot of people to get into production with Destiny 2. So there was a lot of new people coming in, and it meant that they were really kind of at this cultural crossroads for how they wanted to drive like what the studio values were. And when I founded the Bungie Diversity Committee, I identified 3 areas where we could make an impact. And we built pillars around how to be inclusive in the studio, in the Destiny community, and in the industry as a whole. And these are very broad pillars, but once we kind of had those identified, we could source people from the various employee resource groups that existed. Like there was women at Bungie, there was LGBTQIA, people of color, and so on. And we could source people to help with organizing and getting those things done to make change. Another thing that we did here was at this early stage, we prioritized the work, because with this sort of work, there is always too much to do. So what we did was we made a matrix of what that work was, how hard it was to do, and what the impact of it would be. So first we kind of targeted what I will call low-hanging fruit. It's things that are immediate, noticeable, and have good impact. And it kind of gives credibility and quick wins to the committee. And while that was happening, we had people working on longer term goals to shift the overall cultural landscape. And then there were things that were stretch goals that were just nice to have. Okay, so some of the things that we did while I was there was get Bungie involved in the Seattle Pride Parade. So that's what's happening in this picture here. Also, in our second year of participating in Pride, we joined, like we actually worked with other studios in the Seattle area to have a bigger presence there. So it was like just a pile of game devs. It wasn't just people like Bungie. We also made a resource and toolkit internally available for employees at the studio. We ran a talk series and a networking event on various DEI issues with guest speakers. And importantly, we got Bungie leadership to make DEI one of their key performance indicators. So that effectively what this means is the CEO of Bungie was responsible to the board of directors for meeting requirements for hiring and retaining people from underrepresented minorities. So functionally what this meant was they had to diversify their hiring and do things such as interview at least one woman in every loop, rewrite their job description. So we weren't talking about ninjas and rock stars, that sort of stuff. And it was a shift towards like changing the studio culture. And these kind of changes take a long time. So the Bungie Diversity Committee was really the foundation for future DEI work at Bungie, because now they have all these different affinity groups, which also do fundraising. So you might know about these like Black at Bungie, Women at Bungie, accessibility. There's the Veteran Vanguard. And they do fundraising and events at the studio, and you can do things like buy pins and in-game merch. So your Guardians have like little banners that reflects like, you know, what you support, and you can have those in the game. And yeah, this is really one of the first grassroots DEI organizations in a major game studio. And I just kind of did it because I didn't know otherwise. Like I had just come into this field from academia, and I was just like, something is weird here, like how do we fix it? So I was very fortunate that this was supported and I could kind of drive that change. All right, the next thing I want to talk about here as my second example is what I call the 𝗔𝗯cie 𝗗𝗿 Council. And I'm very proud of this term, JEDI, because it stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And we did not have budget for lightsabers, unfortunately, but this was something that I co-founded when I was at Harebrained after George Floyd's murder in 2020. So what had happened was a group of people like devs of color at our studio wrote to studio leadership, and we were just like, hey, we're scared and we're sad and we're angry, and we just want to know how we can be supported while we're at work. Because if you remember, 2020 was a very scary time for a lot of people. So we just wanted to make sure that like when we were at work, we had some support from our work. And we were really fortunate in this case because leadership was really receptive to us and actually worked with us to make sure people felt safe and had time to process everything that was happening in this year. So they did a lot of, like we met with leadership a lot directly. So Harebrained is a much smaller studio than Bungie, so we could meet directly with the C-suite and talk to them about what we wanted to do, and they could kind of see how that fit in with their budget and timeline. And some of the things we achieved here were we got additional days off for everyone at the studio for their mental health. We got everyone got three what they called action days, which were separate buckets of PTO from just your regular sick leave and vacation. And these were action days to do things like attend protests, do self-education, perform mutual aid work. If you attended the BLM protest, you could get access to legal support, that sort of stuff. And one of the big things is really they hired an external company as consultants to help us navigate how to build sustainable policy with a 5-year roadmap. And this last one is really important because it took the labor off the employees who, remember, are all people of color who brought this up, and put it on experts who could do this as a full-time job. So they actually had the time and the expertise to do things like road mapping, this planning, this interviewing everyone at the studio, building a plan and presenting it. And no one at the studio individually could have done that as a full-time job. So this was a really good use of soft power to co-opt hard power from our leadership. And it created a role with the authority to bring about the change that we were pushing for. So just to summarize those two things, here are some learnings from these DEI initiatives for how we understand power. I want to be very clear in both of these cases. I wasn't intending to go in there and make any sweeping changes because, first of all, these are all decisions that were made by people who are in positions of power who could take the budget to give people extra days off, or they could change policy, or they could make committees. And so I wasn't coming into this with any hard power at all. So the first thing I would say is it can be safe to challenge existing power structures, but you have to do so in a way that kind of aligns with the existing cultural norms, even if you are trying to shift those cultural norms. So use your soft power for that. So even if you think, like, personally, that certain DEI initiatives should exist because they're just the right thing to do, this is not the language of business. So you have to kind of reframe this as, how does this affect profits? How does this affect the player base? How does this affect anything else they care about? And I know this sounds really, really gross, but this is what is effective. So the last bullet here is kind of related. So money and power talk. You cannot do DEI work with no budget. And budget is also the way that a company says that it's serious about something. So make them put their money where their mouth is. And what this means is, in some cases, you will have to come up with a budget when you pitch, because you might be the expert in the room about how much these things cost. So be prepared to do that research ahead of time, like know who the relevant parties and stakeholders are and know what they care about. And then tell them, like, what are your goals? Like, how do you get there? How can they help you get there? And make sure that they understand, like, why you're doing this and what you're doing this for. But the other thing is also, you will need an executive sponsor for this. So, remember how I said how hard power and soft power can coexist? People with hard power are often in rooms where you will not be. And you need someone who is aligned with your values to go bat for you. So the way we did it was we actually got an executive sponsor by using soft power, but the executive sponsor has hard power, and then they can go into the rooms wielding their hard power to bring about change that we had asked for. So that's kind of like the first thing for just understanding power structures. This next one here is, I think, really important just as a point of how you actually go about doing this work. You do not have to make the change yourself personally, because I think democratization is really the key here. We're talking about these big issues that require big groups of people working together. So what you really need to do is find other people who will do this work with you. In large studios, there might be formalized affinity groups, like I've talked about, like women and people of color, and accessibility or disability, LGBTQIA, neurodivergence might also be a separate one from that, etc. But it doesn't have to be a formalized affinity group. It can also be a community on social media. It could be on Discord. It could be just some other group that you're part of. And the point here is you get so much more work done when you all work together. This also means working across groups, so supporting initiatives that you do not personally have a stake in or that you do not personally benefit from, because supporting other initiatives will also in turn support what you do. So because not even at the results level, but at the meta level, if you talk about it, learn from each other and share information, you will get better tactics for how you can exercise that soft power. The other thing here is you also don't have to be tanking all the time, because organizational change requires all types. Like, some people are tanks because they are loud and visible agitators. But you also need people who can organize folks, speak other languages than the tank, because business is a different language than tank. You need people to be peacemakers, you need people to be diplomats, and you need supporters to amplify this. So I like to think of this like a D&D party. Like a party is more effective when your skill sets are spread out. So find other people who might not be using the same strategies as you to bring about change. And finally here, imposter syndrome is real. It's very, very real in this area. So remind yourself that you have expertise and why you are doing this work. So even when I was doing this work, and I have a literal PhD in a relevant field, and people are asking me like about company policy and how to proceed, part of me was like, oh God, what if I get it wrong? Like, what am I even talking about? This, like, you know, we could lose all this money, we could close the studio. But a lot of DEI work in games right now in this current climate is uncharted territory. And part of being the vanguard for this sort of work is simply charting that territory. So it is true, you will likely mess up at some point, but that's also okay if you learn from that and you do something differently next time. Okay, this is my last point before we wrap up. I just want to put this here. This is labor. All this stuff does not come for free. It costs time, it costs effort, it costs social capital. So you need to understand what you are worth. So when I started the Jedi Council at Harebrained, I really pushed for studio members to be compensated for their labor. And what I did was actually showed leadership a spreadsheet with my base consulting rate and then multiplied that by the number of people on the Jedi Council multiplied by the number of hours of meetings. And then when you add all that together, like that's a significant dollar amount. And this was actually why they went and got a separate consultant to do this work. So remember not to just advocate for others, but also for yourself and your value. And likewise, burnout in activism and change making is real. So make sure that you take time to self-care, because it's a lot of work. It is very time consuming and it is a long road. So one thing I like to think about here is called the choir principle. So it's something like this. In theory, a choir can hold a note forever, because if any individual drops out to take a breath and then rejoins, there are enough people holding that note so that like one person dropping out to take a breather doesn't adversely impact it. And DEI work to me is like this, because you need to make sure you take the time to rest and self-care and do what you need. And as long as there are enough other people doing that work to keep making progress, it's okay to take a break, but just come back when you are ready. All right, and finally, this is my final thought. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince. So he says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And I think this is especially important in this space. The industry will not, as a whole, do this work because it is the right thing to do. You have to give them a reason to make those changes in a way where they can buy in and understand the why of what they are doing. So show them the value of their work, get them excited about the prospect of change, and more broadly, apply your soft power to do the work in this industry, not because you love the work itself and you love being in planning meetings for hours, or you love doing Twitter activism, or you love putting like ideas fearlessly out into the world, but do this work because you want to see more like equitable, inclusive spaces in the games industry. And do this work because you want to do your part to get there with like-minded people. So it doesn't have to be a formal thing in the workplace, but it is incremental progress to make progress. So I invite you to find those people, use your soft power, connect with them, and do that work together. All right, thank you. That's all I have. Here's where you can find me on socials. And yeah, I guess that's where we wrap up.